The problem was, I had never wanted to fly planes. I wanted to understand how they communicated, how their systems worked, how to protect them from threats that existed in the digital realm, rather than the physical sky. When I enlisted instead of pursuing the academy, Dad's disappointment was a living thing that filled every room we shared. When I chose cybersecurity over piloting, it became a wall between us that grew higher with each promotion I earned, each commendation I received, each success that wasn't the success he had envisioned for me. The drive to Peterson took 45 minutes through winding Colorado mountain roads. I had made this journey dozens of times for various military functions. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Please try to get along with your father tonight. This is important to him." It was always important to him. My feelings, my achievements, my life had never seemed to register on the same scale. The base was transformed for the occasion. White tents stretched across the parade ground, strings of lights creating a warm glow against the early autumn darkness. Officers and their families moved in clusters, dress uniforms mixing with elegant civilian attire. I recognized faces from my childhood, men and women who had watched me grow up in the shadow of my father's career, who knew me as Marcus Chen's daughter long before they knew me as anything else. I found my assigned table near the back of the main tent, a clear indication of my place in tonight's hierarchy. The name card read simply S. Chen, as if even my first name was too much space to waste. Around me, conversations flowed about deployments and promotions, about children following in their parents' footsteps and family legacies being honored. I smiled and nodded when addressed, playing the role I had perfected over decades of practice. The ceremony began with military precision, speeches about Dad's distinguished career, his leadership during 3 deployments, his innovation in tactical aviation, his mentorship of countless young officers. Each word was true, each accolade earned, and with each sentence I felt myself shrinking further into my chair. This was his night, his moment, his legacy. I was just furniture, a necessary presence to complete the family picture. When they called for family members to join him on stage for photographs, I stood with legs that felt like lead. Mom took his right arm, radiant in her navy dress, every inch the perfect military wife. I stood to his left, maintaining the regulation distance, my smile practiced and hollow. The photographer snapped dozens of pictures, capturing what would look like a proud military family for the base newsletter and retirement album. But I could feel the tension in Dad's posture, see the slight tightness around his eyes that I had learned to read as a child. He was performing too, playing the role of the proud father, but his performance was as strained as mine. When the photographer finished, we returned to our seats without exchanging a word. The dinner portion of the evening dragged on with military precision. Course after course arrived, while speakers shared stories and memories. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite lost somewhere between the shrimp cocktail and my father's carefully orchestrated indifference. When dessert was served, I excused myself and stepped outside into the cool Colorado air, needing space to breathe, space to think, space to exist without the weight of his disappointment pressing down on my shoulders. The night sky was clear, stars visible despite the base lighting. I had always found peace in looking up, perhaps inherited from a father who had spent his career in the sky, even though our paths to that same sky had diverged so dramatically. Standing there in my dress uniform, I thought about the choice that had defined our relationship. The choice to serve my country in my own way, with my own skills, protecting threats he couldn't see and didn't fully understand. In 3 days, I would return to my position at Cheyenne Mountain, to the classified work that consumed my days and haunted my nights. Work that mattered in ways I could never explain at dinner parties or family gatherings. Work that had recently involved sleepless weeks tracking a sophisticated intrusion into our satellite communication systems, following digital breadcrumbs through layers of encryption and misdirection, until I found the source, and quietly, invisibly, shut it down. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, I was just Sarah Chen, the daughter who had disappointed her father by choosing her own path instead of walking in his shadow. The daughter who would soon discover that sometimes the greatest vindication comes from the most unexpected sources. and that the approval we spend our lives seeking might be less important than the respect we earn from those who truly understand our worth. As I stood under those Colorado stars, I had no idea that in less than 2 hours, everything would change. That the wall between my father and me, built over years of misunderstanding and unmet expectations, was about to crumble in a way neither of us could have anticipated. The real story was about to begin. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began 3 months before Dad's retirement party, in the depths of Cheyenne Mountain, where I spent my days in a windowless room, filled with the constant hum of servers and the blue glow of multiple monitors. The mountain facility was a fortress of concrete and steel, designed to withstand nuclear attack. But the real battles we fought there were invisible ones, waged in lines of code and digital footprints that most people would never understand. I had always been drawn to puzzles, to finding patterns where others saw chaos. As a child, while David was outside throwing footballs and dreaming of flight school, I was in my room taking apart radios and computers, driven by an insatiable need to understand how things worked. Dad called it a waste of time. Mom called it a phase. But I knew it was something deeper, something that would define who I was meant to become. The cybersecurity division of the Air Force was still relatively new when I joined, viewed by many traditional officers as a support function rather than a combat role. Dad was among the skeptics. He understood threats that came with wings and engines, missiles and bullets. The idea that someone could wage war through fiber optic cables and wireless signals seemed abstract to him, less real than the tangible dangers he had faced in the cockpit. But I lived in that abstract world daily, monitoring network traffic for anomalies, analyzing malware signatures, and building digital walls to protect infrastructure that kept our military functioning. It was methodical work that required patience and intuition, skills that had nothing to do with physical courage and everything to do with intellectual endurance. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in June. I was reviewing overnight security logs when I noticed something that shouldn't have been there, a tiny irregularity in data packet timing that lasted less than 3 seconds. Most analysts would have dismissed it as network lag or equipment fluctuation, but something about the pattern felt wrong, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect symphony. I spent the next 18 hours tracing that 3-second anomaly through layers of network architecture, following it backwards through routers and switches, across secure channels and encrypted pathways. What I found made my blood run cold. Someone had been inside our satellite communication network, not just browsing but mapping, learning, preparing for something much larger. The intrusion was sophisticated beyond anything we had seen before. The attackers had used legitimate credentials somehow obtained from a contractor in Virginia, then moved laterally through the network using techniques that avoided our standard detection systems. They had been there for weeks, possibly months, studying our communication protocols and identifying vulnerabilities in our most critical systems. I immediately escalated to my supervisor, Major Patricia Williams, a former Navy cryptologist who understood the gravity of what I was showing her. Within hours, we had assembled a response team, but the attackers had already vanished, leaving behind only digital shadows and the terrifying knowledge that they could return at any time. The investigation consumed the next 2 months of my life. I worked 16-hour days, sleeping in the break room when exhaustion finally overtook me, surviving on vending machine coffee and the occasional sandwich brought by concerned colleagues. The deeper I dug, the more sophisticated the attack revealed itself to be. This wasn't random hackers or script kiddies looking for bragging rights. This was a state-sponsored operation with resources and patience that spoke to months or years of planning. The breakthrough came on a Friday night in August. I was alone in the operations center, most of my team having gone home for the weekend, when I noticed new activity on one of our honeypot systems. A honeypot was essentially bait, a fake network designed to look valuable while actually being isolated and monitored. The attackers had returned, drawn by what they thought was an undefended entry point into our most sensitive systems. Instead of immediately alerting the team, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I decided to watch, to learn, to let them reveal their true capabilities and intentions while they thought they were operating undetected. For the next 6 hours, I became a silent observer in a digital game of cat and mouse, watching as the attackers systematically probed what they believed were our actual defense systems. What I discovered horrified me. They weren't just planning to steal information or disrupt communications. They were mapping our satellite control systems, studying the protocols that governed military GPS, weather monitoring, and missile guidance platforms. They were preparing to take control of the assets that kept our forces safe and operational worldwide. By Sunday morning, I had documented everything. Every technique they used, every vulnerability they exploited, every system they targeted. I had also identified their command and control infrastructure, traced their communications back to servers in 3 different countries, and mapped the network they used to coordinate their activities. But more importantly, I had figured out how to stop them. Not just block this particular attack, but close the vulnerabilities they had discovered and turn their own techniques against them. It would require precise timing, careful coordination, and the kind of deep system access that required approval from the highest levels of command. Major Williams was skeptical when I presented my plan. It was aggressive, potentially risky, and relied on techniques that pushed the boundaries of what we typically considered defensive cybersecurity. But the alternative was allowing a hostile nation-state to maintain access to systems that could compromise every military operation we conducted. The operation took place over 3 days in late August. While the attackers thought they were preparing for their main assault, we were quietly repositioning our defenses, closing vulnerabilities, and preparing countermeasures. When they finally launched their attack, targeting what they believed were critical satellite control systems, they found themselves trapped in an elaborate digital maze of our own design. Instead of gaining control of our satellites, they found themselves isolated in a carefully constructed environment, where every move they made provided us with more intelligence about their methods, their resources, and their ultimate objectives. We learned that the attack was part of a larger campaign, targeting military communications across multiple allied nations, information that we immediately shared with our international partners. The final phase involved something that had never been attempted before. Rather than simply blocking the attackers, we used their own network infrastructure against them, sending carefully crafted data packets that caused their command and control servers to crash, effectively dismantling the entire operation from the inside out. When it was over, we had not only prevented what could have been the most devastating cyber attack in military history, but we had also gathered enough intelligence to protect against similar attacks for years to come. The techniques we developed became the foundation for new defensive protocols that were quietly implemented across all branches of the military. But none of this was public knowledge. Cybersecurity victories, unlike battlefield triumphs, happened in silence. There were no parades, no medal ceremonies, no news coverage. Success in my world was measured by attacks that never happened, systems that never failed, and threats that the public never knew existed. I received a commendation letter from the Secretary of the Air Force, filed away in my personnel record where only a few people would ever see it. Major Williams recommended me for early promotion, a process that would take months to work through the bureaucracy. But in the immediate aftermath, I returned to my regular duties, monitoring networks and analyzing threats as if nothing had changed. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was preventing a potential disaster that could have compromised military operations worldwide, my father was preparing for his retirement ceremony, probably wondering why his daughter had chosen such an unremarkable career path. The work that mattered most to me was work I could never discuss with him, victories I could never share, achievements that existed only in classified reports and security briefings he would never attend. As I stood outside the retirement ceremony that October evening, looking up at the Colorado stars, I carried the weight of that secret success. I had proven myself in ways that my father could never understand, protected assets he had spent his career using, and earned respect from people who understood the true nature of modern warfare. But respect from strangers, however meaningful, couldn't fill the void left by a father's disapproval. Nothing I had accomplished in that windowless room in Cheyenne Mountain could bridge the gap between his expectations and my reality. Or so I thought, until I walked back into that tent and discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never expected to be warriors, and sometimes the greatest victories are recognized by those who matter most, even when we least expect it. The moment I walked back into the tent, I could feel the shift in atmosphere. Something had changed during my brief absence under the stars. The conversations seemed more animated. Clusters of officers gathering around certain tables with the intensity that accompanied breaking news or unexpected developments. Major Williams caught my eye from across the room and nodded toward the head table where my father sat, his expression unreadable behind his military bearing. I made my way back to my assigned seat, passing conversations that seemed to pause as I walked by. There was an energy in the room that hadn't been there before, a current of anticipation that made the hair on my arms stand up. I had experienced this feeling before, in the operations center when a major threat was detected, that moment when everyone suddenly understood that something significant was about to happen. The evening's program resumed with the presentation of gifts and commemorative items. Dad received a custom flight jacket with his squadron patches, a model of the F-16 he had flown during his deployment years, and a leather-bound book containing letters from the pilots he had mentored throughout his career. Each gift was presented with ceremony and appreciation, marking the end of a distinguished career that had touched countless lives. But then General Rebecca Morrison, the base commander, stepped to the podium with an announcement that wasn't on the printed program. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. I had seen her before at various base functions, but we had never been formally introduced. She was several levels above my pay grade and operated in circles where technical sergeants were rarely invited. Before we conclude this evening, General Morrison began, her voice carrying easily across the tent, I have one more presentation to make. It involves a matter that has only recently been declassified enough for me to discuss publicly. A matter that relates directly to why we do what we do and why the service of every person in this room matters to our national security. The tent fell silent. Even the catering staff stopped their quiet cleanup activities to listen. In military settings, unscheduled announcements from generals commanded absolute attention, especially when they involved classified matters. 3 months ago, she continued, our military faced what could have been the most devastating cyber attack in our nation's history. A sophisticated adversary had penetrated our most secure networks, mapping our satellite communication systems and preparing to take control of assets critical to military operations worldwide. The attack was complex, well-funded, and represented months or possibly years of preparation by a hostile nation-state. I felt my chest tighten. She was talking about my operation, about the work I had done in the depths of Cheyenne Mountain. But why here, why now, why at my father's retirement ceremony? The attack was detected and neutralized by a single analyst who recognized a 3-second anomaly in network traffic that dozens of other qualified personnel had missed. This individual then spent 2 months tracking the attackers through layers of sophisticated concealment, ultimately developing and executing a counter-operation that not only prevented the attack, but dismantled the entire network and provided intelligence that has protected allied nations from similar threats. My mouth went dry. Around the room, heads were turning, people looking at each other and whispering, trying to understand why this story was being told at a retirement ceremony. My father's expression had shifted from polite attention to genuine interest, though he clearly didn't understand the connection yet. The techniques developed during this operation have revolutionized how we approach cybersecurity threats. The analyst's work has been briefed to the Secretary of Defense, shared with Allied intelligence services, and incorporated into defense protocols across all branches of the military. The operation prevented what intelligence estimates suggest could have compromised ongoing operations affecting thousands of service members worldwide. General Morrison paused, her eyes scanning the tent before settling on my section. The identity of this analyst has remained classified until today, when the operation was finally declassified enough to allow proper recognition. I want to share this story tonight because it exemplifies the evolution of military service, the reality that today's threats require today's warriors, and the fact that heroism often happens in places where traditional definitions of courage don't apply. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure people at nearby tables could hear it. This couldn't be happening. Cybersecurity operations weren't discussed at public ceremonies. Heroes in my field remained anonymous, worked in shadows, received their recognition through channels that never involved families or public acknowledgement. The analyst who saved our satellite networks, who prevented an attack that could have compromised military operations worldwide, who worked 18-hour days for months to protect assets that most Americans will never know exist, is here with us tonight. She looked directly at me. Technical Sergeant Chen, would you please stand? The world tilted sideways. Every eye in the tent turned toward me. Hundreds of faces suddenly focused on the woman who had been relegated to the back table, the daughter who had chosen the wrong career path, the disappointment who had failed to follow in her father's footsteps. I stood on legs that felt disconnected from my body, my dress uniform suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The silence in the tent was absolute, the kind of quiet that only happens when something completely unexpected has just shattered everyone's assumptions. Sergeant Chen, General Morrison continued, your work represents the highest traditions of military service. You identified a threat that others missed, pursued it with determination that others couldn't match, and neutralized it using skills that others don't possess. You did this work alone, in classified conditions, without recognition or public acknowledgement, driven only by your commitment to protecting the people and systems that depend on our military's capability to function. She held up a small blue folder. By direction of the Secretary of the Air Force, and with the endorsement of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you are hereby awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service in the performance of outstanding achievement while serving as a cybersecurity analyst with Air Force Space Command. The applause began slowly, a few people clapping as they processed what they had just heard. But it built quickly, spreading across the tent like a wave, until hundreds of military personnel and their families were giving me a standing ovation. I stood there, paralyzed by the magnitude of what was happening, by the public recognition of work I had never expected anyone outside my small team to acknowledge. But the only face I was looking at was my father's. He had risen with the rest of the crowd, but his expression was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't just surprise or pride. It was the look of a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his daughter was incomplete, that the child he had dismissed as taking the easy path had actually been fighting battles he couldn't have imagined. General Morrison wasn't finished. Colonel Chen, she said, addressing my father directly, your daughter's work-protected communication systems that your generation of pilots depend on for navigation, weather data, and mission coordination. The satellites that guided your aircraft, the GPS systems that brought you home safely from deployments, the networks that allowed you to communicate with ground control during critical operations, all of these systems were targeted in the attack that Sergeant Chen prevented. The weight of her words settled over the tent like a blanket. My father, the career pilot, had spent decades trusting technology he understood only from the user side. The systems he had relied on throughout his flying career, the infrastructure that had kept him safe during 3 combat deployments, had been protected by the daughter whose career path he had never understood. The courage required to spend months tracking a sophisticated enemy through digital networks, working alone with classified information that couldn't be shared even with family, represents a form of service that is no less demanding than any battlefield deployment. Sergeant Chen has served her country with distinction, protecting assets that most Americans will never know exist, preventing attacks that could have compromised military operations worldwide. As the applause finally died down, and I was invited to the front of the tent to receive my medal, I caught my father's eye. For the first time in my adult life, I saw something in his expression that I had given up hoping for. It wasn't just pride or surprise, it was respect. The kind of respect that one warrior gives to another, the recognition that service takes many forms and courage comes in many varieties. The little girl who had taken apart radios while her brother threw footballs had grown up to become exactly the kind of protector her country needed. even if it wasn't the kind her father had envisioned. And for the first time, standing in front of that crowd of military personnel, holding a medal that represented work I had never expected to be acknowledged, I realized that his approval, while meaningful, was no longer the measure of my worth. I had found my own path to service, my own way to protect the people and systems that mattered, my own definition of what it meant to be a warrior in an age when the most critical battles were fought with keyboards instead of aircraft. The recognition felt good, but the knowledge that I had prevented a disaster that could have affected thousands of service members felt better. The real victory wasn't the medal or the applause or even my father's newfound respect. The real victory was the quiet satisfaction of work well done, of threats neutralized, of a country protected by skills that had taken years to develop and courage that had taken a lifetime to find. The medal felt surprisingly heavy in my hands as I returned to my seat, its weight a tangible reminder that the invisible work I had done in underground facilities now existed in the physical world, acknowledged by people who mattered. The conversations around me had taken on a different quality. Where before I had been background noise at my father's celebration, now I found myself at the center of hushed discussions and curious glances. Major Williams appeared at my elbow with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Sergeant Chen," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a deserving person finally receive their due. "I wasn't sure they would approve the declassification in time for tonight, but General Morrison has been pushing for recognition of the Cyber Division's contributions. Your operation gave her the perfect opportunity." I looked across the tent to where my father sat, his dress uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations of a distinguished flying career. He was listening intently to General Morrison, who had taken a seat beside him, and was speaking in the low, serious tones that accompanied discussions of classified matters. Even from a distance, I could see the intensity of their conversation, the way my father's posture had shifted from the relaxed bearing of a retiree to the focused attention of an officer receiving a critical briefing. The evening's formal program had concluded, but the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. Instead, small groups had formed throughout the tent, conversations flowing between generations of military personnel who suddenly found themselves discussing a new kind of warfare that many of them were only beginning to understand. I overheard fragments of discussions about cyber threats, satellite vulnerabilities, and the changing nature of national security in an interconnected world. A young lieutenant approached my table with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had been debating whether to introduce himself. "Sergeant Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez from the Communications Squadron. I just wanted to say that what you accomplished, it's exactly why I chose to specialize in cybersecurity. To know that one person could make that kind of difference, could prevent that level of disaster, it's inspiring." His words carried the weight of genuine admiration, but they also highlighted something that had been nagging at me throughout the evening. The public recognition felt strange, almost surreal, after months of working in isolation on classified projects where success was measured by the absence of catastrophe, rather than the presence of glory. I had become accustomed to anonymity, to being part of a community of digital guardians whose contributions were known only to themselves and their immediate supervisors. As more people approached to offer congratulations or ask carefully worded questions about the nature of cybersecurity work, I began to understand that tonight represented more than just personal recognition. It was a moment of education for a military community that was still adapting to threats that couldn't be seen or heard, enemies that didn't wear uniforms or carry traditional weapons. Colonel James Peterson, one of my father's longtime colleagues, joined our growing circle with a bemused expression. "Sarah," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I've been in this business for 28 years, and I'll admit that most of what General Morrison described tonight went right over my head. But I understand results, and preventing an attack that could have compromised satellite communications, that's the kind of result that affects every mission we fly." His honesty was refreshing. Many of the senior officers in the room had built their careers around technologies and threats they could see and touch. The shift to digital warfare represented a fundamental change in how military operations were conducted, and it required a different kind of expertise than what had traditionally been valued in military circles. My father finally extracted himself from his conversation with General Morrison, and made his way across the tent toward our table. The crowd seemed to part naturally as he approached, conversations pausing as people watched to see how this reunion would unfold. The man walking toward me looked different somehow, as if the information he had just received had fundamentally altered his understanding of who I was and what I represented. When he reached our table, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, studying my face as if seeing me for the first time. The medal lay on the table between us, its ribbon a bright splash of color against the white tablecloth, a physical manifestation of accomplishments he had never known existed. "General Morrison told me about the scope of what you prevented," he said finally, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for serious military discussions. "She said the attack could have compromised GPS systems, weather satellites, communication networks that pilots have been relying on for decades. She said that without your intervention, we might have lost the ability to coordinate air operations worldwide." The weight of those words settled between us. Throughout his career, my father had trusted technology that he understood only from the operational side. The satellites that provided navigation data, the communication systems that allowed coordination with ground control, the weather monitoring that kept aircraft safe from dangerous conditions. All of these had been invisible infrastructure that simply worked when needed. "I never understood what you did," he continued, his admission carrying the humility of a man confronting the limitations of his own knowledge. "When you chose cybersecurity over flying, I thought you were taking the easy path, avoiding the real challenges of military service. I was wrong about that, wasn't I?" The question hung in the air between us, carrying 30 years of misunderstanding and disappointment. But his tone was different now, lacking the edge of judgment that had characterized our interactions for so long. This wasn't the voice of a father disappointed in his daughter's choices. This was the voice of one military professional acknowledging the expertise of another. "The work is different," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision I had learned in classified briefings. "But the mission is the same, protecting the people and systems that allow our military to function effectively. Your generation protected those systems by controlling the airspace. My generation protects them by securing the networks they depend on." He nodded slowly, processing the implications of what I had said. "General Morrison mentioned that you worked alone for months, that the classified nature of the operation meant you couldn't discuss it with anyone outside your immediate team. That's a different kind of isolation than what we experienced on deployments." His observation revealed an understanding that surprised me. Combat deployments were difficult, but they were shared experiences. Pilots flew missions with wingmen, lived on bases with other military personnel, and could discuss their work with colleagues who understood the challenges they faced. Cybersecurity work, especially at the classified level, was fundamentally solitary. The nature of the threats and the sensitivity of the systems meant that the community of people who could truly understand the work was extremely small. "The hardest part wasn't the technical challenges," I admitted. "It was carrying the weight of what could happen if we failed, knowing that failure could affect thousands of people, and not being able to share that burden with anyone who wasn't cleared for the operation." My father's expression shifted as he absorbed this information. Throughout his career, he had been part of squadrons, teams of pilots, who trained together, flew together, and supported each other through the challenges of military service. The idea of carrying that level of responsibility alone was something he was only beginning to comprehend. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice dropping to a tone meant only for our immediate conversation. "I spent so many years measuring your choices against what I thought military service should look like, that I never took the time to understand what it actually looked like for your generation. I was so focused on the idea that you weren't following the path I had envisioned that I missed the fact that you were blazing a trail that our military desperately needed." The apology was more than I had ever expected to receive, but it represented something even more valuable than personal validation. It was acknowledgement that military service itself was evolving, that the skills and courage required to protect our nation were taking new forms that didn't always fit traditional definitions of heroism. Around us, the retirement celebration continued, but our conversation had created a pocket of intimacy in the crowded tent. Other family members and colleagues gave us space, somehow understanding that this moment represented more than a father congratulating his daughter on a professional achievement. General Morrison asked me to consider staying in Colorado Springs after my retirement, my father said, shifting to a topic that surprised me. There's a consulting position with the Air Force Academy, helping to develop curriculum that bridges traditional military training with cybersecurity requirements. She thinks my operational experience combined with your technical expertise could help train the next generation of officers who will need to understand both domains. The suggestion opened possibilities I had never considered. Working with my father professionally, combining our different perspectives and experiences to help others navigate the changing landscape of military service, represented a form of collaboration that would have been impossible just hours earlier. I'd like that, I said, meaning it more than I had expected. There's so much that traditional military training doesn't address about modern threats. Having someone who understands operational requirements working with people who understand technical capabilities could make a real difference in how we prepare future officers. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, my father and I found ourselves walking together toward the parking area. The Colorado night was clear and cold, stars visible in the thin mountain air, the same stars I had been looking at earlier when I thought this evening would end with the same disappointment that had characterized our relationship for so long. "I'm proud of you, Sarah," he said as we reached my car. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of unspoken recognition, not just for what you accomplished with that operation, but for finding your own way to serve, for developing skills that our military needed, even when some of us were too stubborn to understand their importance. The drive back to my apartment took me through the winding mountain roads of Colorado Springs, past the entrance to Cheyenne Mountain, where I would return to work on Monday morning. But something fundamental had changed during the evening. The work would be the same, the threats just as real, the solutions just as demanding. But now that work existed in a broader context, acknowledged by people whose opinions mattered, understood by a father whose approval I had stopped hoping for but never stopped wanting. The metal sat on my passenger seat, catching the light from passing street lamps, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most important recognition comes not from seeking it, but from doing work that matters regardless of whether anyone notices. Tonight had been about more than personal vindication. It had been about bridging generational gaps in understanding, about recognizing that service takes many forms, and about the reality that protecting our nation requires constant evolution in how we define courage, expertise, and military excellence. 6 months later, I stood in front of a classroom at the Air Force Academy, looking out at 43 cadets who represented the future of military cybersecurity. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that carried the same determination I remembered from my own early days in uniform, mixed with the uncertainty that came from entering a field that most of their instructors were still learning to understand. The curriculum we had developed over the winter months was unlike anything the Academy had offered before. It combined traditional military strategy with cutting-edge cybersecurity principles, teaching future officers to think about digital threats with the same tactical mindset they applied to conventional warfare. My father sat in the back of the classroom, officially serving as an observer but actually functioning as my teaching partner, in a collaboration that neither of us could have imagined a year earlier. Today we're going to discuss the satellite communication attack that was prevented last August, I announced to the class, watching as several cadets straightened in their seats. The operation had become something of a legend in cybersecurity circles, though most of the details remained classified. We're going to analyze it from both operational and technical perspectives, examining how traditional military thinking and cyber warfare expertise had to work together to protect critical infrastructure. The case study had been my father's idea. Rather than teaching cybersecurity as an abstract technical discipline, he had suggested using real-world scenarios that demonstrated how digital threats could affect traditional military operations. The approach allowed cadets to understand cyber warfare not as a separate domain, but as an integral part of every military mission they might eventually lead. Cadet Jennifer Walsh, a computer science major from Oregon, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do you maintain operational security when you're tracking an adversary through networks they think they control? Doesn't monitoring their activities risk exposing your own capabilities?" The question demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we were trying to develop. These cadets were learning to consider not just technical solutions but the strategic implications of how those solutions were implemented. They understood that in cyber warfare, as in traditional combat, revealing your capabilities to neutralize one threat could compromise your ability to address future threats. That's the fundamental challenge of defensive cyber operations, I replied, moving to the whiteboard where I had sketched a network diagram. Every action you take provides information to your adversary about your detection capabilities, your response procedures, and your technical limitations. The key is developing techniques that neutralize threats while preserving your ability to detect and respond to future attacks. My father stepped forward from his position at the back of the classroom. From an operational perspective, he added, it's similar to the decisions pilots make about when to use electronic countermeasures against missile threats. Deploy them too early, and you reveal capabilities that might be needed later in the mission. Deploy them too late, and you might not survive to worry about future missions. The parallel between cyber warfare and traditional combat operations was one of many connections we had discovered during our months of curriculum development. My father's operational experience provided context that made technical concepts more relevant to cadets who were training to become military leaders rather than computer specialists. My technical expertise helped him understand how digital threats could affect every aspect of military operations, from logistics coordination to tactical communications. After class, we walked together across the academy grounds, discussing the morning's lesson and planning adjustments for future sessions. The relationship between us had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated, a professional partnership built on mutual respect for each other's expertise, and a shared commitment to preparing the next generation of military leaders for challenges that were fundamentally different from what previous generations had faced. The cadets are starting to think like cyber warriors, my father observed as we passed the cadet chapel, its distinctive spires reaching toward the Colorado sky. But they're also maintaining the operational mindset that will make them effective military leaders. That combination is exactly what we need as cyber threats become more sophisticated. His assessment reflected months of watching these young men and women grapple with concepts that required them to think simultaneously like computer scientists and military strategists. They were learning to analyze network vulnerabilities with the same methodical approach they applied to battlefield terrain analysis, to develop cyber defense strategies with the same attention to logistics and coordination that characterized successful military campaigns. The program had attracted attention from senior military leaders across all branches of the service. General Morrison had briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff on our curriculum development, and requests were coming in from other military academies and training institutions for similar programs. What had started as an experimental collaboration between a retiring pilot and his cybersecurity analyst daughter was becoming a model for how the military could adapt its training to address evolving threats. But the personal transformation had been just as significant as the professional development. The wall of misunderstanding that had separated my father and me for decades had been replaced by a bridge built from shared purpose and mutual respect. We had found a way to combine our different experiences and perspectives into something more powerful than either of us could have achieved alone. The quarterly evaluation meeting with Academy leadership took place in a conference room overlooking the parade grounds where cadets were conducting afternoon formations. The metrics we presented painted a picture of unprecedented success in preparing future officers for cyber warfare responsibilities, while maintaining the traditional military values and leadership principles that had always defined Academy graduates. Colonel Patricia Reeves, the Academy's academic dean, reviewed our assessment data with obvious satisfaction. The cadets who complete this program are testing higher on cyber warfare scenarios than graduates from dedicated computer science programs at civilian universities, she noted. But they're also demonstrating superior leadership capabilities and operational thinking compared to traditional technical specialists. The success wasn't just measured in test scores or academic assessments. The cadets themselves were responding to the program with enthusiasm that surprised even the most optimistic projections. They understood that they were being prepared for a form of military service that would define the future of national security, and they approached the material with the seriousness that such responsibility demanded. Captain Mark Stevens, one of the junior faculty members assisting with the program, had compiled feedback from cadets who had completed the course. They consistently report that the program has changed how they think about military service, he said, reading from his summary. They understand that future conflicts will be fought across multiple domains simultaneously, and they feel prepared to lead in that environment. The feedback validated the approach we had developed, but it also highlighted the broader implications of what we were accomplishing. These cadets would graduate and take positions throughout the military, carrying with them an understanding of cyber threats and digital vulnerabilities that would influence decision-making at every level of command. They would be the bridge between traditional military culture and the technical expertise required for modern warfare. As summer approached, my father and I began planning the next phase of our collaboration. The Air Force had approved funding for an expanded program that would include advanced courses for senior cadets and continuing education modules for active duty officers. We were also developing partnerships with other service academies to ensure that cyber warfare education became a standard component of military training across all branches. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying in ways that my previous assignments had never been. In the classified world of operational cybersecurity, success was measured by disasters that never happened, threats that were neutralized before they could cause damage. But in education, success was visible in the growing competence and confidence of students who would carry their knowledge into careers dedicated to protecting our nation. One evening, as we reviewed lesson plans for the following day, my father made an observation that captured the transformation in our relationship. "You know," he said, looking up from a technical manual that would have been incomprehensible to him a year earlier, "I spent so many years thinking that military service had to look a certain way, follow certain patterns that had worked in the past. I never considered that the most important contribution might be helping it evolve to meet new challenges." His comment reflected the broader shift that had occurred, not just in our personal relationship, but in how the military was approaching the integration of cyber warfare into traditional military doctrine. The lessons we were teaching went beyond technical skills or operational procedures. We were helping future military leaders understand that adaptation and evolution were not signs of abandoning military traditions, but essential elements of maintaining military effectiveness in a changing world. The medal from that night at my father's retirement ceremony now sat on my desk at the academy, not as a trophy of personal achievement, but as a reminder of the work that had brought us to this point. The operation it represented had prevented a single devastating attack, but the education program we had built together had the potential to prevent countless future attacks by preparing military leaders who understood the full spectrum of modern threats. The cadet graduation ceremony in May provided a powerful demonstration of what we had accomplished. As I watched 43 young officers receive their commissions, knowing that they carried with them an understanding of cyber warfare that would serve them throughout their careers, I felt a satisfaction that was different from anything I had experienced in my previous assignments. These graduates would go on to lead units, command operations, and make decisions that would affect the security of our nation for decades to come. They would face threats that we could only imagine, using technologies that had not yet been invented, but they had been given a foundation of knowledge and a framework for thinking that would allow them to adapt and respond effectively regardless of how the threat landscape evolved. My father stood beside me as we watched the graduation ceremony, both of us wearing our dress uniforms, both of us reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The disappointment and misunderstanding that had characterized our relationship for so long had been replaced by something stronger and more enduring, a partnership built on shared values and complementary expertise. "They're ready," he said quietly, as the newly commissioned officers marched past us in formation. It was both an assessment of their preparation and an acknowledgement of what we had achieved together. The future would bring new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to make a difference. But I was no longer facing that future alone, carrying the weight of responsibility in isolation. I had found my place in a community of people who understood the importance of the work, who shared the commitment to protecting others, and who had learned to bridge the gap between traditional military values and the demands of modern warfare. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered to celebrate with their newly commissioned officers, I thought about the path that had led me to this moment. The girl who had chosen cybersecurity over flying, who had disappointed her father by refusing to follow his predetermined path, had found a way to serve that honored both her own interests and the military traditions she had inherited. The work we were doing at the academy would continue to evolve, adapt, and grow. New threats would emerge. new technologies would be developed, and new generations of military leaders would need to be prepared for challenges we could not yet anticipate. But the foundation we had built, the bridge between technical expertise and operational experience, would endure as a model for how the military could continue to evolve while maintaining the values and principles that had always defined military service. The quiet revolution we had started in that classroom would ripple outward through the careers of every officer we trained, affecting decisions and operations in ways that might never be fully measured or acknowledged. But that was the nature of the work we had chosen, the impact that mattered most. Success would be measured not in recognition or awards, but in the security of a nation protected by military leaders who understood the full spectrum of modern threats and had the knowledge and confidence to address them effectively. Standing there in the Colorado sunshine, watching the next generation of military leaders begin their careers, I understood that the most important victories are not always the ones that make headlines or earn public recognition. Sometimes the most significant achievements are the ones that create conditions for future success, that build foundations for others to stand on, that ensure the continuity of protection and security that allows a free society to flourish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.